We're sort of online, so we'll find out how long this goes. There's our patrons list, peruse, and thanks absolutely everybody who has been supporting the thing over the last times, and especially those who continue to do so in our troubling, uncertain period. Let's end off with, get rid of this sharing here. Whoop. Okay. Doesn't look too bad. I still haven't seen any indication. Chat overlay is popping along. Let's see whether that has, find out whether or not at new points. Wait a minute, chat overlay. There we go. We are continuing, of course, with replacing Darwin. Oh, hi there, Josiah. There's somebody in the feed. Jeanson is putting up a couple new sources. It's still basically in the chapter where he's starting from a false assumption anyway, which is that his notion of mutation rates and fixation rates and paternal lineages and all that are screwed up. So he has this ridiculously inflated version of how many mutations would have occurred over millions of years, when we can see that in the actual data, and he's just muddled everything up. But the thing is that he does dribble a couple new sources. Most of it, the last couple of weeks, he's just been recycling the same stuff that he cited in earlier chapters. So he launched a paper from 11 on human mutations, which he hadn't cited previously, and implies that they're just kind of minimizing the mutation issue. Also, his teen paper from Yang on the higher mutation rates in hybridized plants. He's hoping that somehow or other the idea that highly heterozygous Adam and Eve or Noah could account for distribution. That ain't going to cut it. I'll be putting the links into both the Lee paper and the Yang paper, but it raises an interesting question about the YEC model, which is that if the mutation issues are okay, wouldn't people who, and so much of a problem for the standard model, wouldn't they be noticing this as they work through all of this? So it turns out that I did some research on who was citing that Yang work. And there's more work on plants by Xi from 2016. I'll be putting the linkages on that. There's a paper from 2021 on yeast, which of course is being the scope of Jeanson's 2017 book, all of which doesn't seem to indicate anybody is having a problem with, oh gosh, this is a high mutation. In fact, it's explaining more and more about the sometimes the rates can go up a little bit because of the dynamics of that individual. And now they're studying individual sets of organisms, yeasts and plants and all that. They can fine tune the understanding of it. This shows how separated the world of, be about the bids for adjusting of fields. Oh, yeah. I'm not at all sure. I have no guarantee about whether or not I'm roboting on that end. So if it's coming as a dismal sound, we'll just have to live with it on there. In fact, I'm not getting a fast response on our hide feature as well. The main thing is you'll get all the linkages in a description of the various papers in the main description, so anybody can follow up on the stuff that I've been indicating. Part 2 has to do with a post that I had originally tumbled onto from back from January 21, Chalk Challenges D-Time Dogma from Dear Gavin Cox at CMI. And it's always, this is from their Creation magazine. And these sometimes deal with really intricate subject matter with footnotes and other not. It bounces all over the point. Anyway, he had gotten a little bit of pushback on this because this month, just a couple days ago, somebody had actually asked for some additional background, and he basically is doubling down on it. So we'll put the linkages in on that. The main point is that he is riffing off of a couple different papers in these two posts. One of them from the 2021 one had to do with a paper from 2016 on the Great Calcite Belt. which relates, and there's a linkage to, I'll be putting that on. And Cox is simply poo-pooing this explanation for what's going on in the natural context. When the questioner challenged him on that, he then jumped to a new paper from 2022, which is on how coccoliths can survive in darkness for a time, just working chemotropic various elements. And is of interest. The paper was talking about the idea that coccoliths needed to survive the KT extinction, at which time there would be an awful lot of loss. There's signs that coccoliths can survive down in the deep ocean, which there's obviously not sunlight down there. So this was exploring a perfectly legitimate issue about how varied the ecology and what kind of chemistry are involved with them. This doesn't the White Cliffs of Dover go away. And so absolutely nothing in that new paper in any way called into a question the rate at which that stuff can accumulate over time, and whether or not it's physically possible to have oceans with sufficient number of them to be able to produce these giant chalk cliffs. Erica, and in fact, when we'll be mentioning this issue in the volume 2 of the rocks were there, because Erica had also called attention to diatoms and coccoliths and bacteria, and doing calculations as to, you realize how much would be in the ocean if all that stuff is happening just in the flood time. You've got this just slide that there's no room for water, or they would push all the water up. It's just an absolute disaster area. So everybody can follow up on that one. I've been doing a bit today, partly finishing up on the origin of diseases and how creationists don't like dealing with them. That's going to be a rather extensive info box in volume 2 of the rocks were there. And then a little sidebar that popped up out of the middle of nowhere as I'm going up on some various creationists who have frittered on about UFOs and ancient astronauts. They don't like them. And the role of UFO belief in the creationist community. It brought up that there's a weird subculture that exists in the creationist community, and it can have nasty effects, because just recently, a guy who was steeped in this kind of Zechariah Sitchin's meets Christian evangelicalism notion of David Icke over in Britain, who has talked about lizard people and mutant aliens and that. This guy, this had been circulating in the little churches this guy attended down in California, and he ended up, his kids were actually lizard people, mutant, and he killed them. And I suspect he's got a lot more mental problems going on than just creation. The point is this is fed off of a culture that just has a wild level of looniness to it. And I think a lot of people may not be aware how far back in the creationist culture the demonic UFO beliefs have been circulating, going all the way back into the 1970s. Often a lot of older farts. My demographic from this guy who killed his kids, a QAnon surfer guy from California. So it's an entirely different demographic going on. None of this stuff gets noticed much in the higher level creationist apologetics, and it doesn't show up at all. This whole subculture is invisible to the intelligent design movement, because they circulate in the collegiate environment, and they do their little things at Oxford University and their little debates at various Christian colleges and all that are way above the grassroots religionist operation that leads to this stuff. And I found a self-publication of a guy who calls himself, I think, John the Redeemer or something like that, writing under a pseudonym, but his name is actually known, Baldish guy, who did a book in 2014, which is about demonic UFOs, and it's all percolating material from the 1970s, including this older material that was lurking around in my reference field that it's popping up now, and it's an absolutely impenetrable book. People can download it for free online, but it's just a mishmash of things, and there's no reason to suspect that people who think exactly like that aren't preaching from various pulpits on these matters in the kind of churches that this poor guy got involved with, and eventually led utterly insane stuff. So there we go. So I'm in about 10 minutes on here. I put a link over hopefully for Jackson, but odds are he won't be able to pop in, and I'll keep riffing off of all that as best I can. The section on the origin of diseases and pathogens is going to be big. It's almost large enough to accommodate an appendix, but I think I'll be able to keep it as an info box. And then, of course, I still got to finish off the little segment on the development of carnivory in the record and how creation is evolving over that time. The creationist position on pathogens in general has kind of evolved, because you could easily have a theological position where it's all due to Satan and evil. Brain bug. Oh, yes. Yipes! I'd have to put a link over on. Let me see whether or not I can. Let's throw caution to the winds here, and boop, there's the stream code. If you want to pop over in here, we can talk about the joys of bugs and critters. At least we'll have a little bit of a guest on here at this matter. Arthropods in general are showing up in kind of sidebar areas, and in some respects, critics of creationism have kind of, because so many of the creationists don't think much about insects in general. They don't like pondering or not. So other than an occasional thing, and I got a little stack of material, and I'm not sure exactly where in the new book we're going to be putting it, but it relates to either think that bugs can survive the flood, they just kind of will dog paddle, or they'll go, their little seeds and stuff will, or their not seeds, but their little larvae and all that will just hunker down inside of stuff and wait until the floodwaters dissipate. But the major problem has to do with the systematics. And whereas if the moment they were thinking about whether or not they're going to put bugs on the ark, they're going to have to deal with an awful lot of bugs. And it's absolutely catastrophic. So there's physically no way. There's just such a volume. In a rote sense, the amount of arthropods in that knocking around are easily as much volume as there are people and mammals in general on the planet. But just in terms of species, 20,000 species of ants. Is any creationist going to be able to figure out how to get from a creator, even if you just have a little pair of little ants on board, can you get to the extant ant population in a few hundred years? Creationists are never going to be able to pull off that hat trick. I mean, they can barely tread water with the mammals. You're only talking about a few thousand species. You've got, with birds, you're up into about the 10,000 species range, and they try to whittle them down to, I think, like 180 kinds, something like that, which basically are bird families. And even that doesn't make any sense in terms of the superstructure. But we'll try to be dealing with an awful lot of that aspect in the appendix, which is going to be pretty nice. Going into the Ark Encounters listed kinds, and then also dealing with more about what they aren't listing. So it'll be sort of a companion piece to the appendix, which will include in the new book as well. It was in the first book, of listing off all the phyla and groupings and how many species and genera and there are in the various groups. But insects, arthropods, are so incredibly prolific that there's no way they're ever going to be able to work it into it. And then you move over into the intelligent design movement, and of course they could care less about any of this. They never even bother about working out insects. So that's an area where it might be kind of a fun part for younger critics of creationism to figure out how can you prod the creationist community to think about these things. And what will it look like if you try to make them do that? Will their brain just explode? Will they just have to scamper back to talking about dogs and cows and familiar barnyard animals, which is the rote routine that you find among creationists? If you look at Nephilim Free or Ken Ham's apologetics bunch, it's reflexive. The pictures they routinely bring up are canids, the dogs, but we know even there they've got difficulties in accounting for how the organisms get to be the way they are. When were dogs domesticated? How closely are they related to wolves and all of that? And it just starts getting into a fog bank on those taxa. So imagine dealing with that, or any of the where they have to deal with how finicky they are in relation to their habitat. So, well, some can get along fine in salt water, others can't. Some can get along in fresh water, others can't. And so what exactly is the salinity of the floodwater? How specialized would it be? Where did organisms live prior to the flood? What was the continental distribution prior to the flood? Everybody, in fact, who wants to follow the creationism venue should always keep in mind that map of time aspect and keep an eye out for when they're not discussing it. So how often do they even bother figuring out what did the space where they lived operate? I live in the Pacific Northwest, so I'm ridiculously aware of the Columbia basalt and the Missoula floods, and we've alluded to quite a bit of that in volume 1 of The Rocks Were There, and up again elsewhere. There's in fact a really spectacular amount of geology that's been done about this region and virtually ignored by creationists. And I would love to see this work out what they think and where it was, the stuff that makes up the Pacific Northwest, all the exotic terrains, and was the Columbia basalt all post-flood? Can you get that much material in the space of a short amount of time? And if so, then how do you account for the parts eroded away during the Missoula floods? When did that happen? How long does it take for this stuff to congeal? Hello, Brainbug. Get you onto the field here. We got a guest. Hello, Brainbug.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. And at the moment, we're running off of 100% signal strength. How we'll muddle along until the signal has a conniption fit, and we'll be ahead of the game. So, what contribution would you like to have about the arthropods? And you study them a lot in terms of how creationists do or do not. In fact, I'm mentioning the creationist and his giant cockroach claim in the new book.
Oh, is that the giant cockroach? That's supposed to be from the Carboniferous, even though there were no.
It pops up because he swallows a bunch of stuff. He mentions the Buxy-Trax and a whole bunch of claptrap in his apologetics, and so you go, boy, these people are just gullible.
But there's nothing to that. Nothing to the Buxy-Trax. If you look into it.
Oh, yes. And in fact, that's one of the litmus test items that I have, because there's a huge divide in creationism as to the ones who accept the Delk print and the Paluxy-Trax and all the Man-Trax stuff, and the ones who don't. And
those are the same ones who accept the living dinosaurs and stuff like. Oh,
yeah. Well, no, it's a divide on that, because you've got you see, the problem is the creationist who accepts young Earth creationism has got automatically in the repertoire dinosaurs and people live together. They were living together only a few thousand years ago. Everything was living together only a few thousand years ago.
All of life.
So all they have to do then is to account for why we don't find signs of that in the geologic column. So back in the 60s and 70s, Carl Baugh and others were the ones who were really pushing, Don Batten and others, who had been pushing these things over the years. And that is a subculture that still is immensely active and still shows up in Kent Hovind world. That world, he's constantly repeating all of this stuff. You climb up to the Michael Ord and Jonathan Sarfati, ICR AIG. Nope. They are well aware. John Morris, all these people that have studied this subject have said, nope, human footprints together in the Paluxy? No, it's just the heel print. We accept that, blah, 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 move on. And yet at the same point, they're very reluctant to drop an anvil on their fellow creationists who are putting claptrap out. So what this means is it's hydrologic sorting of the brain that occurs in the creationist movement, because you've got the high who just kind of stop talking about it. I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Ord's book on dinosaurs that he did about 10 years ago.
Whose book?
Michael Ord. His it's a call on creationist accounting of dinosaurs, and he mentions Glenn Rose once, and it's not about the tracks. He just puts it as a little aside, and there's no discussion whatsoever of any of the man tracks. And there's that quality. Or another one that really struck me. There was a color book that ICR put up for kids during the pandemic just a couple years ago, and they have a whole critters. They say, which ones of these have been found with human beings in the fossil record? No, have been found together in the fossil record. They didn't mention. And the interesting that there aren't any. So ICR, part of their brain knows that this is an area that's like a third rail on the subway. You're going to get electrocuted if you try to bring up this.
There's so many things that fall on that line too. There's like just stuff you wouldn't think that would follow that. Like I was looking into the Turin shroud, the Shroud of Christ.
Oh yeah,
the lore around that, and the same divide there. You got your excuse me, I got the frog in my throat. You got your really out there kind of living dinosaurs kind of crowd that thinks that there's Turin shroud as evidence, like the Hovins. And who's the guy? I just did a video on him just a couple of weeks ago, and I can't remember his name. Who discovered Noah's Ark on the mountainside, and then he discovered the Ark of the Covenant. And
yes. Ron Wyatt.
Ron Wyatt, yes, Ron Wyatt.
He died about 20 years ago. He gets a big section in the new book, because Ron Wyatt connects up with a whole bunch. We'll be doing a complete survey of the various Hunt for Noah's Ark bunch. And Ron Wyatt, basically, he was pointing to a rock formation and announcing that this was the thing. And Andrew Snelling and John Morris and others have said, no.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And so
they're really stand off to him. They like Ron Wyatt at all.
And that connects up with you gotta kind of feel sorry on alternating Tuesdays with the poor upper level PhD creationists who are striving in that Todd Wood careful manner to be rigorous and scientific about it, having to deal with these clown suit oddballs that are throwing Ron Wyatt in there, and Kent Hovind falls in that thing. So it's reinforced.
He was friends with him, wasn't he? Wasn't Hovind friends with Ron Wyatt?
Oh, well, he constantly repeats him. He still the material still gets loaded up in Kent Hovind apologetics. He has never given up on the guy. Although remember, Kent Hovind is like a fossilized brain from 1980. I mean, there's almost no new thinking from him over the last 20 years. It's just recycling the same PowerPoint slides that he's been doing from that period. But Hovind therefore becomes a handy litmus test. If Hovind takes it seriously, this is a bad idea, because he has such a long history of screw ups, including you remember Onyate Man? Have you heard of that?
The what?
Onyate Man, O-N-Y. I'll type it into the little doodad here. Everybody can Google it up. It's back about 20 years ago, and I bet it's understandable why you wouldn't have heard about it, because it's years ago. But there are references to it online. In the late in the 1990s, several creationists put out stuff where they obviously didn't have any evidence for human and dinosaurs together, so they were kind of sufficing with cartoon versions. So there would be like a cartoon of a Tyrannosaurus climbing around through the ruins of the world after the flood, and then dropping dead, on that sort of thing. Well, a couple skeptics in the anti-creationist community decided to hoax them on April Fools, where they came up with a faked up archaeological dig or a paleontological dig where there was literally an Allosaurus skeleton munching a human being who had just escaped from the flood. And Kent Hovind bought into this instantly. And of course, it was a complete hoax. And it was, like all great hoaxes, deliberately designed to provoke skepticism. They had names that were totally fictitious. They had organizations that were fictitious. All you needed to do was to try to search out the source data and you would immediately be suspicious on this. But of course, Kent Hovind didn't do that. There was another hoax even earlier. Are you familiar with the Jamal hoax with Noah's Ark?
No, I don't think
That's
so.
another one. Yeah, see, these are so old. These are back in the 1980s. See, there's the advantage of gray-haired old people that know things from the past. So all of this is going to be in the new volume 2. There was a CBS that was done on the mysteries of Noah's Ark and the Bible. I can't remember whether it was the one that was narrated by Charlton Heston or one of the others. But anyway, CBS did a couple of these things. It was the Cellular Sun Classics creationist bunch that did books and videos, and they got these on CBS every once in a while. And needless to say, skeptics of the period were going, and would be criticizing it. But anyway, one of the things was this very reverential recreation of this Mr. Jamal, who had found the pieces of the ark that he found up in Mount Ararat, and they were showing this thing. And this was a deliberate hoax by Jamal, who had literally taken a piece of wood and baked it in teriyaki sauce to make it look old. He would rip his references, and he had contacted John Morris, and there were a whole bunch of people that were being connected up with this, that were buying into this stuff, that he littered his hoax deliberately with things that ought to have excited their suspicion. One of the characters' names that he came up with was Alice Bullshitian. I mean, it was just ruthlessly fair about it. And so I've always been an aficionado of the April Fool's prank.
Did Morris buy into that though?
Oh yeah. Oh, and everybody just got caught like suddenly it all blew up in their face when all this came out and they harumphed about it. And you can therefore see why they tended not to discuss this in their apologetics. And so it's like 40 years ago. But all of that will be brought in there. And then the latest mess with the Ark is, of course, the NAMI affair. That this pops up. The guy that was just debating me and a bunch of other people have been debating around in Salcord, or not Salcord. Yes, Salcova. Is kind of like his friend and ally in there. Anyway, they're certain that this latest find of the NAMI find, which again is blown up in their face, Andrew Sling has said this is of hoax, and it's just an absolute mess. So this constant tradition of wanting to have the Noah's Ark thing turn out to be. Snelling, in fact, could care less anything with Mount Ararat, because he says Mount Ararat wasn't there at the time. He has the whole mountain range coming up after the flood in this. So that there is another problem that's happened over the years that we'll want to be calling attention to in the new book, is how there's been a great real estate deal in the creationist movement moving around, because if you're old enough to have read old Henry Morris, Duane Gish era creationism, they basically were envisaging the landscape pretty much the way it is now. They could maybe pull Mount Everest and that down a bit to make sure the Ararat was up at the top for that to be where the Ark lands. But the landscape, they didn't like plate tectonics. They didn't like continental drift. All of that they were dumping on. There's been an enormous evolution in young Earth creationism in the years since, where they are now functionally accepting not merely plate tectonics, but lickety-split race car fast plate tectonics. That I think the version in the Creation Museum that AID has the pre-flood world being Rodinia. That's like 800 million year old supercontinent. And then it turns into Pangea, maybe during or after the flood, which is an awful lot of rotation crap going on here.
And you could explain the population mechanics of that too. How'd everything end up where it was supposed to be while the Earth's shifting all around like this?
Yeah. And this is why it's so hilarious from my point of view about the Pacific Northwest, because in Spokane, where I live, Spokane is on the edge of what was once the frontier of the North American continent. But at that time, 300 million years ago, it wasn't facing west, it was facing north. And so what's now the Pacific coast was actually the northern coast of this. And it turns out, you ever heard of the old red sandstone? The Devonian rock formations from, I think, 300 million years ago. And it's
is that West Coast?
In Scotland, Scotland. The old
Scotland?
red sandstone. Yeah. A teeny chunk of it is in the Pacific Northwest. That whole area got pulled apart, and a chunk of it rode along what was eventually going to become the North American continent. And the continent turned with it, and eventually it gets smashed in from these stuff coming in from the Pacific Ocean as the continents are moving along. And then, of course, eventually you get the Columbia basalts and all of that stuff, which it's looking like that's one of the early.
So is the Burgess Shale? I thought
the Burgess Shale. The Burgess Shale is way before that. That's up in 500,000 years ago. All of the major Lagerstätten in the Cambrian explosion, the Burgess Shale in Canada and Xinjiang over in or whatever the hell it is over in China, and the Sirius Passet up in Greenland. All of them were down in the southern hemisphere, along the northern coast of a big supercontinent that was pretty much arranged around the South Pole. There were little segments of stuff that eventually became pieces of other stuff in Asia and North America that were up above the equator. And we still get little bits and pieces of that. There are Cambrian trilobites and that in from Washington State from that period. But all the big heavy action and those fabulous Lagerstätten are in the equatorial zone. And it's the very fact that there are so many Lagerstätten that have gotten distributed since suggests that there's something interesting about the ocean chemistry and stuff that's relating to why they are preserved so well in that particular zone. Needless to say, the creationists, if you're operating under the premise that zones are all moved around from Rodinia after the flood, that means that's how much change has happened from there, from 2350 BC down to when exactly did the existing continental structures go in? And are they pushing the Appalachians up and having them eroding away? That's another little side bit, because they're familiar with modern mountain ranges like all the rest, but all the evidence suggests that the Appalachians used to look like the Himalayas. They were a monster mountain range. And so
they're basically vestige of mountains now. There's not even any that there's only one mountain in the whole range that pokes above the tree line now.
Yeah. That's what struck me about. I was the same thing with the Poconos. When I visited New York many years ago, we stopped for gas up in the Poconos to pick up some stuff before we got into New York City, and they saw our Washington license plate, and they're saying, "Oh, what do you think of our mountain?" And we go, "Oh,
yeah.
We have
really appreciate them, but yeah.
There's one little spot when I drive from Spokane to Seattle to visit my relatives over there. There's one tiny spot I love, and hopefully when I do it, it's on a bright day, because you come up we're about 2,000 feet here, and it drops down to get down to the Columbia Gorge. And then there's this killer vantage hill that goes up. It's the hill that never ends, that you're driving up this fairly steep grade to the point of where older automobiles, before the fuel injection and all that crap, if you had cruise control in the car, you'd have to turn it off because the hill's too steep, and it just goes on and on and on. And you're driving along and you go, okay, well, it goes around that little edge that will be and there's more of it, and you drive around that edge, and there's more of it, and you drive around, and the hill just goes up and up. And so it's about 1,000 or more feet of incline. And you finally get up to a point when you're getting up to the top of that. There's now a bunch of windmills and things up there. And if the weather's clear at this, I think ryegrass is the you can see Mount Rainier 150 miles away, and it just sticks up like the most gigantic pimple. You're going, holy shit, that thing is big, and you can't see it close up when you get farther along. It's totally invisible, but it just looms up there as Mount Rainier. And I think that's what, 14,000 feet, something like that. Now that's a mountain.
Yeah, that's a mountain. I don't think does anything in the Appalachian even get over 8,000. I don't think anything
No.
gets even that high.
And what's surprising too is that even in Europe, how short the mountains are. That they have passes, they have mountain passes that are like at 800 feet. And they've got up at their upper level mountains. Some of the mountains can get fairly tall, but it's fairly flat compared to the say the Colorado Plateau that produced the Grand Canyon. That's moving a gigantic splotch of land that's about a quarter of the United States up to over a mile high to where
so I know the Rockies and the Appalachians are still growing. Are the Alps still growing, or are they receding?
Well, a tiny bit, yes. Well, the Appalachians not, but the
Appalachians are done.
The Andes, basically, you look at any really impressive mountain range, and it's probably growing. And we can measure. I think the Himalayas are going up about half an inch a year, which is coincidentally comparable to the fact that it's being slammed into it about a half an inch a year by the plate. And the same thing is going with the other tall mountain ranges that you can see them measuring up on there. Remember,
if you take the height of Mount Everest and you divide that by, or then you take the 6,000 years from creation.
It's got to move much, and another problem has to do, and this is another one of the little
that mountain going up. You get whiplash riding that thing up.
Yeah, and of course, Kent Hovind only brings up Mount Everest to say there are clams up there, and everyone has to go, no, brachiopods, they're not the same thing. You've been told that over and over and over again. Can't get a grip, and of course, he never will. The neat thing about
that's because the northern slopes of the Himalayas used to be the coast of the Asian continent before India slammed into it.
And it's why there are early whale fossils in Pakistan, which at the time was beachfront property when they were alive. But even worse than that, my favorite, it's pieced together over so many years. I was already aware of the fact that you've got the Deccan Traps on the west side of India, but lesser known is there's a volcanic traps on the east side of India to boot. And it's about 70 years older than the Deccan Traps part. And that measures is the amazing ricochet pool game that was going on with India, where India originally was down in the southern hemisphere. It requires ice age stuff at the bottom end of India, right at the tip on there, and a lot of catastrophes and all the rest thought that there was going to be that it had moved around catastrophic. That there, when it had an ice age back in the Silurian, it wasn't where it is now. And amazingly, that guy on the stupid Noah's Ark thing tried to argue. He's not a normal young Earth creationist, but he thinks that the ice age was the flood, and so he's sort of maybe 30,000 years ago or whatever. But anyway, he tried to argue that the Silurian ice age data from this was actually from the Pleistocene. Oops.
But those ice ages had completely different readings, right? I mean,
right, yeah. But anyway, what's neat about is that India is now separating from that southern supercontinent, and by about 95 million years ago is roughly at a spot where a hot spot was that also is where New Zealand is now. And so there's a bunch of volcanic deposits that are right off of the coast of New Zealand underwater, the other half of which is now separated and pulled because India has moved on. So it slams into this hot spot and makes a turn. And now it's heading north, and it stays north, and it's been staying north ever since. And about 65 million years ago, it's crossing the Seychelles hotspot, and there's volcanic eruption there. That's where the Deccan Traps comes from. The other half of that is still at the bottom of the Indian Ocean. So we can trace the trajectory And then by about 50 million years ago, it's coming in, and that Tethya Sea is shrinking, and there's little critters going around, and the early whales are pumping along and all of that stuff. And then finally it slams in and starts pushing up the Tibetan Plateau and all that kind of stuff. Try to speed all of that up. Just that part. I mean, anybody that rubs your hands together knows the faster you rub, the hotter it gets. And so
the time frame we have now, the standard geological time frame is about as fast as you can for India. I think India is the fastest continent that, or I guess it's not. Well, it is.
It's going at a clip. Another one that landmass that are actually fairly stable. There's varying ranges, but roughly at the rate at which your fingernails grow. Which you think of a fingernail, but if you realize a continent moving like that, that's pretty impressive. And it's the reason why there's so much heat and stuff going on down below. What has been such an area that, again, we're going to be discussing in the new book. If Nick Zentner, the geologist from Central University, who he's pointed out that Washington State in the Pacific Northwest is like the Holy Grail for geologists. We've got it all. It's not obvious. We don't have nearly stuff. The human origins, you got to go to Aldovai mammals, you got to go to South America or the Karoo in South Africa. But really, geology, we have glaciation, we have mountain building, we have volcanic eruptions, we've got gigantic repeated flood material, and these wonderful little fossil bits from these geological things. And what has happened in the last 5 or 10 years is a gigantic revolution in geological mapping and ground penetrating bit. The same kind of technology that is used to process signals in spacecraft and all that kind of stuff from radiations. They're applying to the signals that you can send down and bounce off of the bottom inside these varying layers of rock going way into the mantle. And you can process that or whatever, and you can reprocess that material to where they can start measuring the effects of when a plate is coming in and starts dying down. What happens to it? What happened? We can see what happens with producing Pimple Mountain ranges, the Cascades, and all of that. You can see what happens with the Andes. That the highly water-saturated rocks are percolating up, and that's why the rocks of the Andes look the way they do, and they're different from other mountain ranges because of the amount of water saturated going on. But what is happening to the part that's going down? It turns out it starts crumpling up, and it looks exactly like those wiggly little hard Christmas candies you get. Literally.
Yeah.
If you need a visual representation of it, it looks just like that. And they're long and squiggly like that. And they kind of clog up and stay there like anchorages inside of the. And there's one that's from that were moving along 300 million years ago. North America has since moved over it. So now deep underneath New York City is one of these squiggle candies. That's the back end of the plate subduction. That was when North America was way far over from where it is, and to some extent even rotated. They're going to do this now with the stuff in New Zealand and that area. Eventually, they're going to be doing this kind of analysis for all the different subduction zones around the planet. So they're going to be able to start recreating paleo-continental data and shifts. There's a bit about these. That's why the geology here is so interesting in the Pacific Northwest, because you've got all these little bits and pieces, seamounts, which are the equivalent of a big magmatic province of water, pretty much. And once in a while, they'll get to the point where they'll bubble up, and you might have an island on top of it, and a little bit of things like that with Iceland today. And you can see what that looks like. Well, there have been a bunch of those in the Pacific we can't see now because they've been subducted completely, except for bits and pieces of them that have gotten pulled apart and chunked, and this bit over here and this squished up into British Columbia. It's just amazing.
RJ, I wanted to mention real quick before you get too far into it. What I always think about when we get to this topic about the edges of these tectonic plates creating the islands, the volcanic islands out there, is I'm it's kind of nostalgia, but a little bit sad about it, because like even islands today, they're on these subduction zones. the islands that raise up there, they get this really unique fauna and flora and fauna all across the board. Thinking about all the ones that we're never going to see, all these unique island faunas from different ages of the world that have been subducted, and we'll never know what kind of bizarre organisms evolved in these isolated pockets.
What lived there? What's elements? What wonderful things happened on it? There's a possibility of, well, there are some signs there may have been some island chains in the Atlantic Ocean that probably had some biogeographical role in the shifting of organisms from Africa to South America, and that sort of, and we can't tell because the islands have disappeared completely. So all you have left, and even worse, the big frame before anything was alive on the sea, to where we don't have to worry about. But think about all the stuff that was going on in the oceans in bacteria that we have no knowledge of, because maybe whole lineages have gone extinct, and because we only have living organisms to look at. How many bacterial things, how much changes, how much stuff of transfers and transfers and endosymbiotic phenomena that we're looking at only the iceberg tips of them in existing organisms. There's getting closer to work out the details about the mitochondria and all of that stuff. So that whole period of that vast complex ecosystem that's building up like a storage battery, masses of genetic shifts and changes that eventually are going to see the explosion of your arthropods, which by any stretch of the imagination are the most successful organisms on the planet. They're almost extinction proof. I think only in the Permian did some of the insects have kind of a slight speed bump where they're going, oh, something happened. Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, there's some mammals stepped up and said, hey, we're going to take these top niches, but there's niches that tetrapods never even had a shot at, because arthropods had already perfected them for, about 1 billion years on land before that. Oh, not really 1 billion years, but
and what is so fascinating about it, you've probably read enough creationism to have spotted this already, is the one thing that really comes out to me about it is how drab and uninteresting it is. Apart from just going, gee whiz, look at how complicated that is. See the handiwork of God. But they never explore very much about it. And so they need to learn a heck of a lot about it. So they never can get to the stage of understanding much of it.
That's because you write God in the explanation and you call it a day, and then what?
Yeah.
And you're going to write that in every explanation. We get to keep exploring and digging and finding new discoveries and linking them together and trying to piece the puzzle together and try to paint a story of our natural history on this world, of life's natural history in this world. And we're going to get stuff wrong. We're going to put a puzzle piece in the wrong place once in a while. We're going to put one in upside down. Things like that's going to happen. That's where
as the creationists
latch onto those and say, let's throw the whole puzzle out.
Well, the creationists just take selected puzzle pieces and trim them off until they can make a set that they can assemble to go God. And that's as far as it goes. But they have to leave the vast majority of it out. And it makes it rather uninteresting. To my mind, I'm so fascinated to see why arthropods have done the way they do. Or the other thing that where you start seeing bigger picture issues of it. It always blows me away to know that most animals fly.
Right.
Especially it's insects. But even among vertebrates, the most speciose vertebrate species are the ones that fly. Your bats and birds.
Right. Yeah. Bats are the second most numerous clade of mammals, and birds are
mammals are bats, rats, and asterisks. and then again, you wonder about what the dynamic feature of how incredibly relentless and successful birds are, and although they have had their little ups and downs, and then always puzzles me.
They had that whole KT extinction event, but I think they're doing all right.
Yeah, well, and that's the other fascinating thing about it is that the birds that made it through the KT aren't the dominant birds before. That you had the Enanthronithines and all of that bunch. In other words, there was an enormous diversity of which the lineages that went off to the birds that we're familiar with are kind of like the little outliers on the side. So that's part of the notion that that one of the things that pops up as one of the tropes of mass extinction events is that groups that are kind of resilient are if they can make it through, second wind, whereas we're all tied together in complex, intricate networks that they maybe gotten a little too codependent for their own good. Those are the ones that tend to go poop during the mass extinction events. And so it's relevant to what we do now. Are we arbitrarily constructing a mass extinction event where we're causing the wrong keystone species to screw up? And we don't want to be on the back end. Oh, yeah, only the pterosaur flyers. Yeah, that's another issue is why, first of all, why did all of the non-avian dinosaurs die out? That always intrigues me. And then what exactly about the pterosaurs didn't make it? There has clearly been a shift because the early pterosaurs are very small. They're about the size of a crow. The
toothy.
Yeah, very toothy. And then only later, possibly as a result of the appearance of the early theropod birds, that they start getting their niches altered, and the smaller models are being supplanted probably by early birds. So that means that the ones that are making it are the giant one Archaeosaurus,
the ones that live on the
Waddlus and all that bunch, and some of which got to be as big as giraffes. They argue that an awful lot of them then were a bit too specialized for their own good and couldn't quite make the dynamic. It all depends on what their metabolism is, how easily variable. Some of these very giant ones may have not been terribly good at flying. They were maybe gliders and pretty much landbound as a result. So that's why I'm sure the same thing is over in the bug side. You know, if you could get into a time machine and go back to see what they were actually like, what were the giant dragonflies of the Carborus as a species and all of that.
Griffin flies were there's so many unique things about them and the way they fly, because there was, these are, I don't use the design terminology, these were prototypes of early wings that you see in the griffin flies. They lack some specific specialized features that you see in all insects now, all surviving clades of insects, well, the ones that have,
and even as I understand, the dragonflies have a somewhat different construction mode of their wing system as opposed to the stuff that finds in the beetles and that. So things have been invented again and again in multiple modes. And of course, now they're starting to look more and more into the genes that are developing it and how this is working out, from how much of it's related to gill structures and how much of it's related to
a lot of Hawk stuff going on. Yeah.
And how much of the living organisms on the planet are just iterations of the genes that are developing come from? That's I've always liked to probe to creationists. Did Ediacara biota have HOX genes? Use your design theory to tell me what you think about this. Whereas from an evolutionary point of view, my suspicion is, yes, they did, but we don't have any of them to look at.
Yeah, we can only speculate. I mean, you're talking about soft-bodied, Archaea era, or Archean era.
One thing that's going to be funky, because they've started this whole paleogenomics thing that have happened within my lifetime. That's why I'm like a kid at the candy store when it comes to how the science is doing, to where just like I never thought I'd live to see the day when we could be casually talking about how many planets there are around other solar systems by observation, which is what we can now. And the same way that in principle, they can start experimentally tinkering with and modeling the functionality of these gene systems to work out what kind of genes would an Ediacara frond have to have had in order to produce the form that we see. And so it may not be happening entirely within my lifetime, but in the next 50 or 100 years, I would be pretty much gobsmacked if it wasn't the case that a lot of paleo engineering has gone on to where they've just tiptoeing into it, but they've already been working out, for example, what genes are converting a dinosaur, the tooth, the beak of a bird, how the leg structures and the limb structures and the gene shifts and that are occurring that produce the wing of a bird. That's stuff that's directly experimental. And the creationists paid no attention to it. And poor Kent Hovind, he's off there still flitting around with the claptrap that he does on his video channel.
We hit a snag though on the.
Oh, we have got another person here! Yay!
No, that's just the video I'm sharing.
Oh, okay.
An extinct rat shows CRISPR's limits for resurrecting species.
Well,
a few missing genes in an animal recreated genome could be a problem. Study suggests.
Well, that's partly there are always going to be limitations to things because of the role of stochastics, of just luck, and the interconnections of systems. Because you've got a genetic kit bag always has ups and downs, and so that's it ultimately leads to why we have moral problems as a vertebrate species, because for everything there is a downside. or what did Edna Ferber, this is, in front of every silver lining there is a dark cloud. And and that kind of covers all the little bit of it. Yeah, CRISPR is just a little subsection of a thing, of a very promiscuous genetic system, and so at least by that tool, that they're going to have limitations as to what they can deal with it. But I think there will be a genetic system that will be not unlike what's going on with that retro-engineering of the geologic system. That's going to be
so CRISPR is just not the machine that's going to bring animals back from extinction, but it's one of the gears in which we'll be able to reconstruct these organisms. It's one of the many gears.
Although there will occasionally be scientists amongst the ones who are creationists and will do little work that will contribute to it. All practical purposes, I will predict that absolutely nobody is actually in the creationist community is going to supply any of the serious material on here. Did you have another thing you wanted to share?
Oh, no, that's all I had.
Oh, okay.
I just got you.
I'm just seeing a little sidebar on there. I'm amazed the system worked on that. We have gone almost a whole hour without a glitch. I'm absolutely delighted that to been able to do that. It's all the disadvantages of running off a completely free Wi-Fi system. You know, the studio here, I don't have to pay a dime for. Although I always smile, because an awful lot of people who do pay through the nose for their systems to do their weekly broadcasts or daily broadcasts, they often get into problems with audio and signal problems and all that. And I'm going, and you're spending money on this? Okay. Well, at least I'm able to do this on absolutely nothing. And the way we can go. And so long as I can download the stuff. Oh, I'm sure you've noticed the same thing. Do you feel like gods when it comes to how much information we can get at our disposal without paying a dime?
Yes, it's. I mean, you got this little device in my pocket. I'm connected to all the information in the world right here.
Yeah, and I make use of all the varying elements. I do like working on my PC because it's got a more comfortable keyboard and all that kind of stuff. My fumble fingers and all that are limiting. But the main point is that I can acquire so much information. When I was first starting out this game back in the mid-1990s, I was limited in how much I could criticize Dwayne Gish, for example, because he would be citing technical journals that I had no access to. Available in local colleges, I would have had to have written off to somewhere to find them. The scientists involved. Those that were available,
library that carries them too. You could do that.
Yeah. And so even though we have 3 colleges in this area, the local public library didn't carry Nature magazine. So I had to go over to Gonzaga University if there was an article in Nature, and I would have to physically photocopy it. So that was an expense problem and an income, because you're spending and all the rest kind of stuff. Now very, very awkward. Now,
and the quality was always. I remember the 90s. I was probably that kid in the library, the volunteer that you'd hand them to go make copies of it for you. Yeah.
And so anybody in the young kids bit, don't you dare look down your nose at us. Instead, you should go, we are unworthy. It is so fabulous, the amount of information that has. And it also means that anybody who remains stupid and ill-informed in the year 2022 has no excuse but their own laziness, because they cannot possibly say, Kent Hovind can never swear on his holy Bible that he doesn't have access to any of this information. But we know from various people that have debated him, including me, is that you will bring up stuff with him and he'll say, well, I haven't heard about that, but I'll look into it. And of course, he never does because he's a lazy effort. Whereas I intend on making as much use out of the material as possible. So all the stuff that I've been doing on this little book, the second book, you have the rocks were there? Shameless plug for.
I think I have a digital copy.
Ah, yeah. You may have noticed it's fairly sizable.
Yeah.
And so everybody that dives into this area, in principle, can do that level of. So you could theoretically be doing a wonderful analysis from the arthropod perspective and pull all the material together and make it available to other people as well. And the more people that do that, in astrophysics and in geology and cosmology, as well as the biology fields and all of the rest. And in addition to people that you see popping up on Paula Gia's channel on the religion front and the archaeology of the Middle East and all of that, we're bumping into aspects of it because the young earth creationists stumble into it. So there's stuff about Sodom and Gomorrah and the Tower of Babel, and of course the Noah's Ark bits, including the evolution of the Ark. Looks like, I just love that super tanker version that they have at the Ark Encounter.
It should be a box, right? It shouldn't have a bow or
it evolved over time. Again, we'll be citing the material on this. The medieval versions are the cute little boat shape. What? They were following the boats they saw. So caravels, which are kind of bulky little craft of the 1500s and that, were the kinds of boats that people saw. So they just extrapolated that. Then it was the thinkers in the 16 and 1700s, basically the Bishop Ussher era, are the ones that have to kind of figure out, oh, how, okay, Ark, it says this by this box. So that's when they start making designs in their graphics that look basically like a Holiday Inn Express. It's just a big blob, a box. And that stays thing, and that gets popularized in the 1980s era. And some early studies where they were trying to figure out how seaworthy the thing is. And it is quite true that if you build a great big box, theoretically out of wood, and it's fairly stable dynamically, it won't necessarily roll over. It doesn't mean that even when they try to do wave analysis, that it won't be doing this. And you can imagine a ship that's that big, what's going on with the little critters inside and how they're falling back and forth and all that. And will one, and then the issue is whether or not there's carnivory aboard and all of that. That one, they're just like the plate tectonics, the creationists, they've evolved on this point to where creationists are pretty much backing off from post-flood carnivory. They're pretty much easing towards the doctrine that carnivory occurred after the fall, but was already in place all through the fossil record. And that's a really big sea change from the old style approach. But you still find fossil brain Kent Hovind, he's still stuck in that post-flood carnivory model. So
Hovind's model is that there was no carnivory before the flood.
Yes, and that's the Henry Morris era, 1970s creationism. That was the doctrine that was very popular in that period, and it stayed pretty much the dynamic one. And I've been cataloging the various examples of how it, and that's why if you see
creationist historian, huh? You
duh, yes, yeah, because people, first of all, most of the young people today, how are they going to get their information about creationism? They're only the stuff that is online. That's creationism. Answers in Genesis and Kent Hovind videos, and that's the creationism worldview. Whereas for my era, there was none of that. You had to read a Henry Morris book or listen to a lecture that was at your church or whatever. And so there was a different dynamic of going on. So what happened was that the notion that carnivory came from the fall of man, that's a given. That's part of the core doctrine. All the creationists hold to that. But that it took place after the flood got place, oddly enough, fairly recently. And it was in the 19th century, the one group that were pushing that were vegans, vegetarians. The vegetarian movement put that carnivory was not natural. That was a byproduct. Ironically, the biological analysis, including the arthropods, suggests that it's the other way around. That carnivory is the natural mode, and all the herbivorous forms are evolved, derived
from
versions of
carnivores, or scavengers or detrivores. But yeah.
There was a brand new study a couple years ago that we'll be citing in the work on that, where they went through all the different phyla, and so I was quite surprised to see invertebrates and all the arthropods showing up on that. But yeah, it's pretty much across the board, in addition to the mammals and reptiles and all that.
Animals, I think it was like for about 500,000 years before they started trying to eat plants, because they couldn't get through the cell walls or whatever to get nutrients out of them.
Oh well, yeah, and there was a long-term process of what's going on in there, and there was, of course, the arms race. The dinosaurs had to change their eating behavior to be able to crunch on stuff, because so many of the new angiosperms had the consistency of celery, and so it was tougher on them. They couldn't just rake the stuff off the way those sauropods did with all those conifers.
Mm-hmm.
The easy peasy, easy pickings a bit. And a thing that just popped up with the disease angle is that the Black Plague, which apparently has a fairly long lineage in Asia, but never went far beyond that for a long time. And it turns out that somewhere about 1000 BC, some mutations occurred in the mosquitoes that changed a gene that allowed their gut to be a more pleasant habitat for the bacterium that causes plague. And that caused it to spread. So the mosquitoes could now bite you and infect you in a way they couldn't before, because the little thing. Now, this is like 1000 BC. Did God design this to do that, the malicious little bastard? Or is it just a natural variation on this?
Are you talking about the bubonic plague? Or
the bubonic plague, yes, or sinus pestina.
Fleas then, right?
And the other surprise that occurred to me had to do, I've got a little section on it, it's called Chlamydia Gets Around. There's a availability about how long that's been in the human species and all that thing. That goes back a ways. But the group that chlamydia comes from apparently dates back about 700 million years. What was it doing? It turns out that there's an evidence that chlamydia as a parasite of early organisms are leading to the formation of plants, because they're inadvertently facilitating the incorporation of cyanobacteria plastids in plants as a part of their little side biology. Oh, it's interesting. So chlamydia gets around.
Yeah, sure does.
Okay. So we're past the hour. I think we should probably call our luck to a halt on here. Thank you for coming in. The signal looks absolutely marvelous. The non-gods were with us on here. We'll see everybody next week. You got kind of an open invitation on that kind of stuff.
If I see flying solo, I'll always try to jump in and help you out.
But yeah, and keep also a pace on the idea of any cute little bits about any creation. I bet you will have found that by and large creationists don't mention insects all that much.
No, and they weren't even on the ark. They were in driftwood, I think is the current model, which doesn't make sense for most insects. It does make sense for some of them.
And that's why I had the same problem when I was doing my early work with my love of dinosaurs. I'm Mr. Dino Geek. Not quite as serious as Dapper Dino, but still. But the thing is that there's so little discussion of the dinosaur issue in the anti-evolution movement, non-existent in intelligent design. They could care less about it. And just a little snippets of it in the creationist angle and in connection to the origin of birds. So in any area here, pay attention to what doesn't get discussed. That's as much as what actually does get discussed, because the creationists will want to home in on the things they can think they can make apologetic points for. Okay, so everybody stay safe and keep on. We're past the mask phase here in Washington State, and hopefully we will not have to go back on that if we numbnutses don't cause problems. And all we have to contend with is high gas, but I got a hybrid car, so gas prices don't bother me. So anyway, we'll see.
I'm not worried.
See you next week, kids, and don't accept any wooden